It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Ben Newell, who will give our public forum tonight. Ben's on the faculty at the School of Psychology in UNSW. He's a cognitive scientist who spent a long time helping us understand human reasoning, how people think about decisions, how they understand the problems of the world around them, and also applying this kind of work, not just the fundamental understanding of how people reason and how people think, but how this works in real-life examples. So decisions about saving for retirement, how people understand those, and how people reason about the greenhouse effect and climate change, how people think about risky decisions. This mix of applied and basic research is what makes Ben just right for this kind of public forum tonight. So we'll present some things that are a mix of both, and hopefully in a fairly accessible way that's great for all of us, no matter what our background. So I'd just like to say thanks, Ben, for coming tonight, and over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the introduction. I will try and, it's kind of a weird setup, but I'll try and be looking around whilst talking. So I've titled the talk Intuitively Irrational, A User's Guide to the Science of the Mind. I'm not sure that you'll necessarily go away with lots of top tips about how to use your mind, but I should hopefully give you a sense of the kind of research that some that I've been involved with and some that lots of other people around the world have been doing, which tries to give us a few insights into the way we make judgments, the way we make decisions. So one thing that I think we're all probably too aware of at the moment is that the intellectual environment that we find ourselves in, sometimes in the news media, has been changing rapidly, getting corrupted perhaps by, let's call it, some fake news claims. So this slide's already out of date, right, because Sean Spice is lost to history by now. But we became aware of him, most of us became aware of him at the start of the year when he was telling us how big this crowd was at Donald Trump's inauguration. We then had Kelly and Connolly telling us about alternative facts. I think it's quite apt given that we're in room 101 here at the moment. But my favourite piece of Trumpania from the last few months is this tweet that he put out, which I'm sure many of you remember. Despite the constant negative press kerfuffle. But even better was Sean Spicer's comeback when he said this. So there's a challenging information environment out there to try and figure out what's real, what isn't real. How do we kind of dissociate the wheat from the chaff? And we know that if we go looking for information, we can get a vast variety of different opinions. So we know that there's lots of opinions out there about whether global warming is something that we should care about, whether it's real, whether we need to be taking action on it. There are people that say you should never vaccinate your children. There are people that say you must vaccinate your children. There's people who argue if you live next to a wind turbine, you're going to get very sick. So these things change. We have to try and balance up this information, figure out what's right, what's wrong. How do we do that? What are the kind of what do we know about the way our mind works that helps us filter this information? One thing we also know is that the way that we search for information on the internet in itself can push us in different directions. We can find information that's different just as a function of how we've searched before. And there's a little bit of debate about how extreme this kind of channeling or information, channeling of our search has become. But Eli Pariser was the first guy to coin this phrase, the filter bubble, the idea that everything is filtered through the particular information bubble that we currently live in. He gives an example of people searching for the term British Petroleum, or BP. One person, based on their search history, would arrive at pages about the share price of the company, whereas another person, based on their search history, might get information about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. Some people have challenged whether or not this actually does happen, but any of you that have bought anything on the internet or have booked a hotel on the internet know that marketers use this. Okay? I don't want to go to Brisbane again next week and stay in a hotel. I just went there last week. Stop asking me whether I want a hotel in Brisbane. So this kind of way of searching, we have to think about it. We have to think, what is it that I'm getting? Where's the source of information? How do I evaluate it? And the news is full of challenging claims. This is a story, which is one of my favorites from the last few years, about it's a journalist who made the point that he could fool people, he could fool other journalists, basically, to get a story out which was completely untrue, or completely based on completely flawed science, and yet he could get it into the internet and get it to spread. The story that he got to spread was the idea that eating chocolate makes you lose weight. Great, there's lots of chocolate over there. The interesting thing about this is he did actually do the study. Okay, he recruited participants, he ran the study, he even got the study published in a journal that said, sure, we'll publish it, just deposit 600 euros in our account. But it was in the peer-reviewed literature. And then he released this information via press release. It went to lots of journalists, it spread, they just published the press release. They didn't actually ask him questions that were pertinent. They asked questions like, what kind of chocolate did your participants eat? They didn't ask questions like, how many people did you actually have in your experiment? Answer, about 10. In other words, not enough to draw any strong conclusions. So there's this tension, I guess, between wanting to accept and believe information that we like the sound of, that sounds plausible, that fits with something that we'd like to believe, and the need to be more critical, to go beyond just that initial basic piece of information, go beyond that initial source and think about why am I getting told this, where's this information coming from? And I want to just go through a few examples now of a little bit of audience participation examples to give a sense of how it is we might arrive at these kind of different conclusions about the information that we're getting. And these examples are supposed to illustrate different ways in which we can think. So with apologies to anyone who has done Psychology 101, which I know there'll be many of you in here, but just play along anyway. The good thing about this is even if you know it, it still won't help you. So the task here is to shout out the color of the ink of the word that's going to appear on the screen. Okay, the color of the ink. Everybody ready? Here we go.
Blue. Red. Yellow.
Okay, so everyone experiences that kind of tension between the one response and the other response. We know we're supposed to be saying the ink, but we can't help respond with the word as it's written on the page. Here's another slightly more higher level example that, again, apologies to all of you who've seen this one before. So the question is, a bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? I won't get you to shout it out, but just think quickly. What's the answer? Okay, the answer is 5 cents. How many people thought 10 cents? Quite a few people. 10 cents seems to come to mind very readily because it sort of fits with the idea that it's $1.10 and the dollar bat. But if you stop and you think a little bit more, then you get a very different, well, not a very different answer, but an answer that's different by 5 cents and is mathematically sensible. So this is the first example I gave you is a very well-known Stroop effect. It's been around in the literature since J.S. Stroop published it in 1935. This bat and ball problem comes from a 3-item test known as the cognitive reflection test, which is aimed to test our ability to cognitively reflect. Published by Shane Frederick and Daniel Kahneman. And again, the idea that they're trying to get at is this tension between giving one answer and giving another answer, thinking a bit and thinking a bit more. Here's one final example that you can have a think about. So if I tell you that you've got a die that has 7 black sides and 3 white sides, and I'm going to give you $1 for every correct prediction that you make, and then I ask you to predict the outcome for 10 rolls of the die, what are you going to do? 7 black sides, 3 white sides. Now again, the kind of quick response, or one not well thought through response, might be to say, well, I know that sometimes it's going to come out black and sometimes it's going to come out white, so I should probably allocate my responses roughly in proportion to the probabilities. So I might say black, 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 white, black, white, black, black, something like that. If you do that, you'd be doing something that's known as probability matching, so you're matching the proportion of outcomes, but it's not going to earn you as much as if you do what's called probability maximizing, which is just saying the more dominant color on every roll. Right? Because the die doesn't have a memory, it doesn't know what it rolled on the previous trial, so it's always the most likely thing that you have to say in order to maximize your outcome. Okay. So those are sort of 3 different examples that try to illustrate this tension between responding in different ways. And Daniel Kahneman, pictured here, has popularized this idea of there being these 2 systems, System 1 and a System 2. System 1 is supposed to be automatic, supposed to be quick, no effort, no sense of voluntary control. Whereas System 2 is supposed to be attention-demanding, effortful, slower, deliberative, and analytic. And one of the things I want to do today is actually kind of challenge this idea that System 1 and System 2 is a useful way to think about, or is the only way to think about this kind of thinking. And I also want to highlight that I think it can create problems in giving an overly negative, overly pessimistic view of our rationality or irrationality. So in Kahneman's sort of interpretation, saying 10 cents in the bat and ball thing, or being tricked in the Stroop effect, or doing the probability matching response is a System 1 type response. It's automatic and it's quick and so on. One reason that I think just labeling it as System 1 and automatic and quick is kind of not the full story, is that for some people that bat and ball problem is not a quick, fast response. I've been in situations where I've sat with a whiteboard and had to explain to people why it's not 10 cents. That's not a fast response. That's a very slow, deliberative, analytic, but just wrong response. So I think this dichotomous 1 versus 2 distinction is really not necessarily helping us. And as I say, I think it gives us this slightly pessimistic view of what's going on. It also leads to then a huge number of biases that have been identified. And I've just put up on the screen all these different types of information biases that are supposed to be out there: anchoring, confirmation, sunk cost. And this way of dividing up our thinking into either kind of correct or incorrect, or biased versus unbiased, fast versus slow, leads to this huge bias inflation, I think. And it feels as though we're explaining something by identifying these errors, but I'm not sure that we're really giving a strong kind of characterization of exactly why it is these errors are being made, or what we can do to overcome them as well. So this graph is one that I created based on some writing of a guy called Pat Cross-Kerry. So what I've plotted here is kind of the number of biases that have been identified in the literature across the years. And the paper that sort of first introduced this heuristics and biases approach was by Tversky and Kahneman back in 1974, and they introduced these kind of 3 main biases that they talked about: availability, anchoring, and representativeness. Over time, there's then been more and more of these things come about, and Cross-Kerry, who's a very interesting writer, writes about clinical decision-making, emergency room decision-making. But in a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine recently, he talked about how there's now more than 100 biases affecting clinical decision-making. And so I'm extrapolating here to, from 2013 when he published that to 2017, how many more of these biases are we likely to come up with? And does it help us just by saying, oh, you got it wrong, you got it wrong, you got it wrong? What's that telling us about how cognition is actually working? And at worst, I think it invites us to think about different ways of conceptualizing how we think, and different ways to then improve our thinking. So is this dichotomous system 1 and system 2 the only way to think about how we think? Are we just creating a list of biases by doing this? Are we imposing a kind of false dichotomy? Are we setting ourselves up to say, well, that's in system 1 and that's in system 2, and then we've explained it? And are we also permitting a kind of abdication of responsibility? A kind of well, my brain did it, so I don't have to worry about it. I think this is one of the things that begins to become problematic once you get this notion of the system 1 being automatic and without awareness, without effort, that you can kind of say, well, it was my unconscious did it. I didn't know that, it was nothing to do with my decision. It was an unconscious bias, to bring in a term that's become very popular recently. Here's an obligatory cat video. Hopefully this will work. This is just to illustrate the point that by giving ourselves a list of all of these different biases, it's kind of like saying, well, if I make a decision this way, maybe I'm falling foul of confirmation bias. If I make a decision that way, maybe it's availability bias. If I do this, maybe it's omission bias. And it's kind of like playing a game of mental whack-a-mole, which is what this cat is doing here. That's a finger that's appearing in the box, in case anyone was wondering. And yeah, the idea that it's mental whack-a-mole. And Cross-Kerry, in talking about the medical scenario, lists these 100 different biases that maybe people are falling foul of in the medical context. But what does that mean about how we might train people to not be biased? Does that mean we need to come up with a specific remedy for each of those different biases? Does it mean that if it's not that one, then it might be this one? If it's not that one, it might be that one, and so on? I don't think that that's necessarily a helpful way to go. The other thing that is problematic, I think, with this System 1, System 2, going back to the notion of this kind of abdication of responsibility, is that once you talk about something being automatic, then it's sort of this slippery slope from automatic to intuitive to unconscious. And I think one of the interesting things about psychology as a discipline is that as lay people, we all feel that we have a certain expertise about our own thinking and our own decision-making, right? So Psychology 101, one of the first things we talk about when first years come into a psychology course is that our goal is to go beyond the kind of common sense intuitions that we all have about our own behavior. Psychology is a unique discipline in that we're thinking about the way that we think, and we all think about the way that we think. And so in order for it to be a sensible science and for us to be able to offer insights into that, then we have to go beyond just these simple common sense intuitions. And I think one of the things that's happened when you start to talk about unconscious influences on decision-making and the fact that our unconscious brain can do all these kinds of things or be biased in these particular ways, is that it kind of gives license to the psychologist to say, well, you might think you know what's driving your behavior. You might think you know why you're making these particular decisions, but actually you don't, because it's your unconscious. And only I can tell you about that because I can design these particular experiments and I can show these kinds of unconscious influences and these changes in your behavior. And if you want to pursue that line of reasoning, then you have to be very, very confident that you have the right kind of evidence as a scientist to say, yes, I can say something about what your unconscious is doing and that you are being biased in these particular ways. And often, I think that the evidence for those kinds of claims are not as strong as perhaps some people think they might be, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. As a slight side angle, I think the other danger of labeling System 1 as automatic and is that intuition kind of gets rolled up into that, and then there's questions about whether intuition is irrational or not. These two people on the screen are two people who I think capture something very sensible about intuition that I think gets lost in a lot of discussions more generally. So whether or not intuition is rational or irrational is kind of the wrong question to ask. I think that, as Herbert Simon says, a very famous economist, the Nobel Prize winner, also psychologist and organizational theorist, he's just said that intuition is nothing more and nothing less than recognition. Albert Einstein said intuition is nothing but the outcome of earlier intellectual experience. And the crucial thing here is that that intuition can then be useful if that experience is relevant and representative. So can you be sure that this situation that I'm in is one that is something that I actually have gained some appropriate knowledge in? Am I in the right position to be able to make this judgment? Is this a task that I've done before? Is this a situation that I found myself in before? And if it is, and if you've got the right kind of feedback and you've got the right kind of environment to learn in, then that previous experience can be very, very useful. If it's not, if your feedback has been very unreliable or you've got a biased sample of information, you've been taken down that channel by just searching for things that confirm one thing and the other, then that sample of experience is not going to be useful, and your initial kind of gut reaction, your intuition, is not going to be the right thing to rely on. So to sort of chuck intuition into System 1 or to try and make a decision about whether it's rational or irrational is not the right thing to be doing. It's evaluating the situation in which intuition can be relied on versus when it can't. We need to think about, in Robin Hogarth's work, we need to think about educating that intuition. Okay, so to turn back to this notion of, we as psychologists can tell you something about your unconscious and to tell you about, effects on your behavior that you're completely unaware of. I did some work with David Shanks at University College London a few years back where we published a large review of papers that claim to find unconscious influences on decision-making. And the clue is kind of in the title. This is a critical review of that notion. And what we concluded in this paper is that if you actually look at the experimental tasks, you look at the laboratory situations where you can have a very, very tight control over the information that people are aware of or unaware of, and you can really assess that, then there's very little evidence that people in kind of higher level cognition decisions, not talking about the decision about putting one foot in front of the other, or the decision about whether to blink, but actual judgment, decisions, reasoning, choices, there's very little evidence that those can be clearly biased by unconscious processes. And yet, this notion gets a lot of traction in the media, it gets a lot of traction in the literature. But often the claims on which it's based are not super strong. And I want to give you a sense of one experiment that I was involved in that tried to look a little bit at the evidence for a particular claim about how our behavior could be biased, how our behavior could be primed in a particular way. So this experiment is about the idea that you can improve your intelligence, or you can become more intelligent just by thinking about being a professor. Okay? And that if you think about being a soccer hooligan or some other kind of stereotypical stupid person, and no offense to soccer fans, then you are not so smart. Okay? You won't perform as well on a general knowledge test. This is a paper by a Dutch experimenter called App Dijksterhuis. It's a great title for the paper, Relationship Between Perception and Behavior, or How to Win a Game of Trivial Pursuit. And in their experiment, what they got people to do was, first of all, to list the appearance, lifestyle, and behavior of either a typical professor or a soccer hooligan. So this is one group of participants think about the soccer hooligan, one group think about a professor. And then, in an ostensibly unrelated task, so this is not, they're not being told, and now we're going to see if that thinking about a professor makes you more intelligent. It's completely unrelated. So this is the claim that these influences are happening outside of your awareness. You're then given a general knowledge quiz with questions like, what's Europe's longest river? And the claim is, and here's some of the data, that if you are thinking about the professor, then you get more of the answers right than if you're thinking about a stupid person. So 55.6% versus 42.5%. Okay. Now that seems like quite a bold claim. Seems kind of surprising, but it's not atypical of lots of claims that have been in the literature in this behavioral priming, this social priming situation that this task is based on. There's lots of things out there now that suggest that things completely outside of our awareness can sway our behavior one way or another. So, along with David Shanks, we were interested in looking at this effect. Our initial hypothesis was that perhaps you could indeed find this effect, but it wasn't due to it being outside of people's awareness. It wasn't an unconscious bias. It wasn't unconscious reasoning. It was simply that people were seeing the kind of link between one task and the other. It was a kind of a demand effect or a motivation effect. So that was our initial hypothesis. We ran 9 experiments with nearly 500 participants, and we couldn't find the effect at all. So we failed to replicate this intelligence priming paper. And in fact, we found considerable evidence in support of the null hypothesis, so in support of the idea that this manipulation actually had no impact at all on people's performance on the general knowledge quiz. So this is the point here is that psychologists can make very bold claims about system 1, intuition, being biased, and so on, but you need to be clear that the evidence that these claims are based on stands up to scrutiny. And our attempt to see this effect, we didn't find it. That got us into a bit of trouble with Dijksterhuis, who, the author of the original effect, who commented on our paper in the following way. Substandard experiments, harmful to colleagues, misleading to readers, damaging to science, etc. We argued that that was an inappropriate reaction to our work, but it goes to show that we've struck a nerve here. There is tension in the literature between how much should we be saying, yes, we're impossibly biased by things outside of our awareness, versus, well, no, actually, if you do the experiments carefully, then you can't find any impact of that. It's not just that particular intelligence priming thing, or indeed the behavioral priming at all, that's problematic. And I think this is a conversation that in psychology we've been having. It's a difficult conversation we've been having over the last 5 or so years, and that's just about the reproducibility of our science in general. And again, if you're going to make bold claims about how predictably irrational people are, then you want to check that those claims are based on reproducible science. This is a paper that came out in Science a couple of years ago by Brian Nosek and the Open Science Collaboration, where they went through and tried to estimate the reproducibility of a whole range of different findings in 3 prominent journals in the field. Psychological Science, JP, Journal of Experimental Psychology, Learning, Memory and Cognition, and Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. These numbers here refer to the replication rates of the experiments that they conducted. So they selected a whole bunch of experiments published in these journals in 2008. They got a team of people to go, hundreds of different labs around the world, to go and try and replicate these experiments. And they found that, on average, across all of them, about 1/3 replicated. Okay, so this is a worrying finding, I think. And it's an important finding if we're wanting to communicate the importance of our science to the public, communicate what it is that we know about how the mind works and how it affects people's judgments and decisions. So one of the things that's come out of this whole kind of soul-searching is the need to engage in proper registered replications. So rather than just sitting away and beavering away in our own little labs and doing things on our own, it's to say, okay, let's get together as a collective. Let's go and think about our science, how reliable is it, and do a registered replication report. What that means is that we agree upon the exact way in which we're going to run an experiment. We're going to come up with a protocol that we all follow. Then we're going to go and collect the data, and then we're going to decide exactly how we're going to analyze the data before we collect it, and then we're going to be tied to the conclusion that we end up with. And that process is actually now ongoing. Off the back of the intelligence priming paper that we published, Dijksterhuis then came back and said, okay, well, let's do this properly. Let's do a registered replication across lots of different labs and see what happens. And I was hoping to be able to tell you what the answer behind this question mark was, but my lab was involved in the replication, along with, I think, about 70 other labs around the world. But although the guy running replication was actually visiting us a few weeks ago and said, oh, yeah, it's all going to be, we're going to know soon, he still hasn't actually released the results, so I'm not quite sure what's going on. I could come up with some conspiracy theories, but I won't. But I think that, we've turned a bit of a corner there. So I think there is, recognition in the field that we need to improve the way that we do things. There is recognition in the field that some of these bolder claims about how we can be biased by our unconscious, how we can be primed to do things outside of our awareness, how we can be entirely irrational about things has been tempered a little bit. But I think that there's a need to maybe de-emphasize that dichotomous thinking a little bit more. And my suggestion here is just to, rather than think about it as two systems, it's not a very bold or exciting statement, but really the difference in most of these problems is just between thinking a little bit in a very narrow kind of confirmation bias type way and thinking a little bit more in a bit of a broader way. And most of the de-biasing techniques that people talk about are exactly that. They're saying, just stop and consider an opposite conclusion. Stop and consider why this chocolate study might not be actually really true. Stop and consider why it doesn't make sense for that bat and ball to be $1.10 if it's not, you don't have to think about it as invoking some whole other system, some intuitive, unconsciously biased system. It's just, there's one way to think, and you either think narrowly or you think a bit more broadly. And the crucial thing is knowing to be able to sort of introspect in a way, or know when it is that you're being led down that narrow path and not, and being able to click into or consider that opposite in the broad context. Now, and here's an example of how you can push someone to think, rather than thinking narrowly, to think broadly. So if we go back to that simple dice game that we had before, this is just a result from one of my papers showing that if you, it's quite a boring task for the participants, but if you give them experience with rolling this die, so now imagine I've asked you that question, but you're going to sit in front of a computer screen and you're going to see this die rolling 50 times, or whatever, 50 trials, so 300 times. It's very boring. But gradually, if I give you feedback about the outcome, if I show you, look, it's black more times than it's white, then across trials, I will start saying black nearly all the time, right? I'm just going to start maximizing. So this has forced me to start thinking more broadly. If I don't give you any feedback, so these guys are doing an even more boring task of predicting it each time, but then not seeing what the outcome is. They just flatline on probability matching. Okay? They keep persisting with that white, even though they really shouldn't. They're losing money. Okay? But it's breaking them out of that narrow thinking. Okay. What I want to get to in the next part is just to say that so the bias system 1, system 2 thing is problematic. That isn't to say, though, that different ways of presenting information, different ways of framing information can't lead us to different kinds of judgments, can't lead us to different decisions. And the fact that it does can then give rise to important interventions and important ways of improving our thinking or changing our thinking. So this slide is just supposed to illustrate that lots of times in psychology experiments, we're doing what's called a between subjects design. So one group of subjects get one way of presenting information and another group get another way of presenting information. And those different framings can lead people to make very different decisions. And I'm going to give some examples from some of my work that shows how these simple framing changes, when the information that you're being given is equivalent, say mathematically, those framings are not psychologically equivalent. They lead to different choices, they lead to different behaviors. So here's one from the domain of risk perception. This is a paper done with Carissa Bonner quite a few years ago now. She was interested in communicating health risk statistics to people, and she compared different ways of framing what you can see is identical information. So the top one above the line says 100 people die from cancer every day. The one below the line says 36,500 people die from cancer every year. Now those are equivalent, and yet one of them in our sample evoked a higher degree of perceiving a risk or thinking that there was a risk than the other one. I don't know what your intuition is, but in our sample, this one was the one that people found more risky. They didn't like that one as much. So the big number kind of outweighed the temporal frame in that context. So the mathematical equivalence is not the same as psychological equivalence. Here's another one from a kind of environmental domain, environmental behavior. So this was a study where we were just interested in eliciting people's willingness to engage in different kinds of environmental, pro-environmental behaviors. So only using energy light bulbs, not littering, regularly using reusable water bottles, etc. And the difference between the two conditions here now, the way that we manipulated, was that one group were given this sheet of paper with all of these different things on it and were asked to circle the items that they would be willing to engage in. Okay, just put a circle around the ones that you'd be willing to do. And another group were told, cross out the number that you would not be willing to do. So again, the framings are kind of equivalent, but interestingly, they elicit a different pattern of results. And what we found was that overwhelmingly, the people given the exclusion, cross the things out, ended up endorsing many more of those activities. So they ended up with 70% of the items still on the sheet being endorsed, whereas the people that had to think, well, which ones would I actually do, ended up only circling about 50%. So it's a kind of difference in your starting point that you can think of as why that might elicit a different pattern of preference.
Could that be a fear of commitment?
It could easily be a fear of commitment, yeah.
I'm not going to come back to that answer.
Okay, one last example coming from some of the work that I've been involved in looking at ways to communicate the impacts of global warming and climate change. This is a study done with Mark Hurlstone, Steve Lewandowski, and one of their students, Brittany Sewell, where we were interested in people's willingness to endorse policies to cut emissions. This is a hypothetical scenario, hypothetical setup, but what we're interested in is how can we convey to people the impact of different emissions cut scenarios on their income, effectively. So it was like saying, okay, if we put this carbon tax in, this all seems horribly outdated now. This is from 2012, when published in 2014, when carbon tax was a thing that people talked about. So again, between groups manipulation, one group were told, if you endorse 25% carbon emission cut, then this will have an impact of a $1,200 per person impact on the national income, which is a statistical averaged forecast. The forecast all came from Treasury documents. $1,200 per person impact on your income by 2020. Okay, so that was one way of communicating information. A separate group were told that the impact numerically, it's going to work? Numerically is exactly the same, so it's the difference between 55,900 and 54,700, which is 1,200. But the information is communicated in a way that shows that your income is still going to go up. So this is where the income was sitting at the time of the experiment. The income's still going to go up. It's just not going to go up quite as much as it would have done had we not had any type of emission cut. So with no emission cut, it will go to here. If you go to the 25%, it will go to here. And what we allowed people to do in the experiment was click different buttons that would make it a 5% emission cut, a 20%, a 25%, 15%, and so on. And clearly, the difference here is that this is being communicated purely as a loss. This is being communicated as a foregone gain. Okay, so it's kind of, okay, you could have got that amount, but it's just a little bit lower. Whereas the other one is just a straight out loss. And one of the points we made in the paper was that at the time, the rhetoric about the carbon tax was always in terms of a loss. It was always in terms of this is going to be a huge impact on your income, and not making the point that things will still go up. They just won't go up at quite the same rate. Perhaps not all that surprisingly, people that were given this foregone gain framing were much more likely to endorse higher levels of cuts. So they would be endorsing the 25% rather than the 5% or whatever it was. So that foregone gain information, even though, again, it's mathematically equivalent, is not psychologically equivalent. It has a difference in their willingness to commit. Okay, so these kinds of observations, these sorts of framing effects and ways in which you can change people's preferences, change their willingness, change their commitment, has become very, very popular in recent years because of its potential to actually impact directly on the way in which policy is developed and the way in which, I guess, societal level implementations of behavior change are being done. A lot of this has grown from the work of Cass Sunstein and Richard Thaler, pictured here. They published a book in 2008 called Nudge, Ways to Improve Health, Wealth and Happiness. And they describe a nudge as any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives. So those three examples that I just gave you of different frames, you could think of as different nudges. They're different ways of changing people's choice, not by changing anything about their actual ability to choose or the information that they get, just by framing it in a slightly different way. One very straightforward nudge that they talk about is this one, which some of the people in the room might be familiar with. I don't know if you can see this, but there's a little fly here in the urinal. And the idea is that that might help when you're at the urinal. It nudges you towards not leaving the bathroom in such a state afterwards. So that's a very simple nudge. There are now lots of nudge units around the world who aren't just developing urinals, but are doing much more important and exciting work. There's a behavioural insights team here in New South Wales in the Premier and Cabinet's office. There's a behavioural economics team in the Australian government, behavioural insights team in the UK. And all of these places are really taking this behavioural science, this cognitive science, and thinking about how can we apply it to policy, to developing, to changing the choice structure that people have. Here's an example of one from the New South Wales unit. They teamed up with the State Debt Recovery Office, the people that send you those nasty fines when you're speeding or parking in the wrong place, and they changed the wording on the bills that they sent out. And they trialed, basically, did a big randomized controlled trial where they changed the wording of how to try and get people to pay. So they had ones that said amount you owe rather than just amount owed, or they had ones with big red stamps on it saying pay now. They had other ones that said things like 8 out of 10 people pay on time, you should be one of them. Those kinds of things. And each of those implementations, each of those interventions are all based on the kind of science that I've been talking about and the kind of lab-based demonstrations that, yes, different wording, losses versus gains makes a difference. social norms, what other people do makes a difference. And indeed, they found that one of their versions of the trial notice did have a significant, not huge, but a difference in the payment rates of the fine enforcement orders. So this was the standard notice. This is the one with particular wording that improved that response rate. So these are all, I think, useful downstream influences of how this kind of nudging can push people towards changing their behavior. It's obviously a very different way of doing science. It's not really, these randomized controlled trials that they're running are not necessarily establishing the whys, they're really just establishing the whats. So they might be able to send out 12 different letters, and then whichever one works, they pick it. They might not know why it works. The interventions might have been based on some science. Why this one works in particular, they've probably got no idea, and they might not care. I wrote a piece in The Conversation about this a couple of years ago, just pointing out that although in the policy setting, knowing the what might be the only goal, knowing the why is really important, especially if you want to know what happens when that nudge stops working. You don't know why it works in the first place, and if it stops, you don't know how to get it working again. It is difficult, though, to get that mixture, to get that point of kind of connection between running these big trials and being able to infer the why as well as the what. And I've got a student at the moment, Annalise Bolton, who's been working with one of the nudge units here in New South Wales, and it's a very different way of doing science than just going into your lab and running an experiment with undergraduates. And we've actually written a paper about this trickiness between applying the behavioral science to the public policy and this notion of a Goldilocks zone, getting it just right so that you have the right mix of the kind of what and the why. Okay. I'll just quickly mention this and then I'll be pretty much finished. So this is just going on from that, the what and the why. I just like this because I like Weebles because they're scary. Does anyone know what a Weeble? This is a Weeble. Anyone seen Weebles before? There were toys when I was a kid in the UK. They're pretty scary looking, I have to admit. But the point here is just that the nudges, the pre-intervention nudge, we're in this position. You then get nudged, and maybe you pay your fine more quickly. But the interesting question is, where do you end up after that? Okay, how do we figure out whether or not you're going to rock back? So the tagline for the Weeble toy is Weebles wobble, but they don't fall over. Right? So they just go backwards and forwards like that. And maybe we get nudged and we go backwards and forwards, but we end up settling back to where we were before. And so I think there's lots of interesting questions that really need to marry that what and why in order to figure out how to predict this Weeble's position. Okay. There's a Weeble wobbling. Right. I thought I'd better get a picture of the brain in somewhere given the nature of the institute. So there's my brain picture. And I just want to finish on this quote from George Miller, who's, I guess, one of the fathers of cognitive psychology. He says, the mind survives by ingesting information. In a very general sense, all higher organisms are informivores. And I think more than ever now, we have the ability to satisfy that hunger, that informivore hunger. Because we can click on all sorts of things that sound very pleasing to us, but we need to exercise this kind of checking ourselves, this thinking about where's the information coming from, how's it been framed, how's it been presented to us, are we just being pushed down a particular narrow alleyway, or should we be thinking more broadly about, more critically about where we are? Those insights that we can get from thinking about those different ways of thinking, I think, can have very important influences in this field of nudging, and figuring out exactly how we're nudged and why we're nudged and for how long is an important challenge at this boundary between, I think, the basic science and the applied science. And I will leave it there. And if you want to read some more, there's a book. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions for Ben. So if anyone wants to grill him on nudges or why he believes what he believes, now is the chance.
I think was first.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you had... Go, Al.
Oh, right. Thanks, Ben. That's a great talk. I noticed on the map that you showed about all the countries interested in nudging behaviour tended to be sort of Northern European, North American and Australian countries. Australia, you can use that. Is it cultural? Is there some sort of cultural bias to nudging, or do you find it across cultures?
That's a very good question. I think at this stage, so that map's a bit out of date because there was a nudge unit in the White House, but it's been closed down now, funnily enough. So the first one started in the UK. David Cameron set one up, and that one, I think, spawned the one in Sydney, which then went to New Zealand. There's one in Singapore, which is run by people who were in the one in Sydney. But it's a very good point. I mean, in general, a lot of psychological research, people talk about this weird population, the Western industrialized, whatever the rest of the acronym is. But the point being that it's, you know, so much of psychology is based on undergraduates doing things in Western countries, and the extent to which that generalizes is a very good question. But I think, you know, there's probably differences in cultures that are more versus less conforming, or have the ability to be more versus less conforming.
Doug, did you want to go?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Ben. Really interesting.
Thank you.
Just going back to your system 1, system 2, broad, narrow, broad. Presumably there are time constraint issues there. I'm sort of getting at, do we examine our students wrongly in the sense that if you give them MCQs, you give them a minute to answer, you've got 5 options, are you going to push them towards using system 1 and narrow as opposed to, you know, system 2 and broad? Is there any evidence for that sort of implication?
Well, I mean, I think that, yeah, the less time that you, I mean, there's actually some interesting research on giving people the opportunity to go back and change their answers in multiple choice questions. And often people think that the first one that they come up with is likely to be the right one, and so they shouldn't go back and change it. But the research shows that the opposite tends to be true, that actually some additional time to reflect on it can lead you to perform a little bit better. So I think having a combination of both types of testing is probably the right way to go, because for sure you'll be forcing people into a particular pattern of thinking otherwise.
I seem to remember you had a research project a few years ago that was about sleeping on it.
Yeah.
You know, where the idea that you'll make a better decision if you sleep on it and answer tomorrow. But if I remember rightly, that had a different conclusion, right?
Yeah.
The extra time in that case either did it make no difference or make a small difference?
So the original claim was that if you had a complex decision and you took time to think about it, then you would do worse than if you were distracted and let your unconscious brain do the decision for you. But unfortunately, that one also didn't survive the replication test.
Right.
And although the original paper was published in Science and, you know, got
Yours
a lot
wasn't.
of... Mine wasn't, no. And none of the other failures to replicate were either, of which there were many, many more. But yeah, that claim, you know, that sleeping on it. I mean, there's some evidence for it in memory consolidation, but even that is hard to verify. But this notion that you can disengage and the unconscious does magic stuff and then the answer pops out is, again, even in, you know, incubation and problem-solving type effects, it's hard to really get good evidence for that.
There's a question up here.
Thank you, Ben. That was great.
Thank you.
Just a question about this term nudging that you mentioned tonight. Where is the line between nudging and manipulation?
Very good question. So the original authors, Thaler and Sunstein, used this term libertarian paternalism, which is kind of oxymoronic in the idea that, you know, they're allowing freedom of choice, but they're kind of pushing you in that direction. It's a very blurry line, right? It's a line that is, you know, how am I as the choice architect? Why is it my role to design the environment in a way that I think is best for you? Right? How am I really allowing you completely free choice over what you're doing. An interesting example is in the UK, they just introduced, relatively recently introduced, a 5p charge on plastic bags in supermarkets. And some of the nudge guys said, look, this is a win for nudges because the use of plastic bags dropped by 80% or something. But that's kind of a tax. It's not a nudge. It's a you're going to pay extra if you do this. The economic incentives are no longer the same. There's a difference, and I've legislated it, I've manipulated it. So I think it is a grey area, and it does rely on there being some overarching theory that that's the right way to do it. I mean, I guess in the case of the debt recovery, it's fairly benign. There's nothing. If you get a red stamp on a letter versus just being told, pay now, that's not really detrimental to anyone. But once you start to try and apply it to more complex social policy issues, then I think it does become very grey.
You've been introduced the concept of being narrow and broad, so it was being too narrow in the thinking allows you to go and choose the nudge, and thinking would allows you to identify the nudge and decide whether you want to be nudged.
Yeah, that's right. And I think being aware that you're being potentially manipulated or pushed in one direction is important. Yeah.
Sorry, speaking as a man who gets a lot of fines, I'm most amazed that only 15% of people pay their fines.
I think that's
nudged my behaviour.
I think that's payment within specified time frame. It's not overall. Yeah, it's not overall payment before the cops take you off the road. Yeah.
Sorry, there was a question.
That was really, really good.
Thank you.
So I'm just thinking the way that we tend to ingest media now is very much with that kind of first stream narrow thought, right? We get given the headline,
Yeah.
and we like to agree with it. We like, that's what's happening. Is there a lot of research now? Well, I feel like there probably should be, but is there research not by, say, institutions who are, governments and such, or like people like Facebook, who are looking at this nudge principle, applying it in other, maybe not so healthy methods?
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that marketers have been using it forever, right? In some ways, there's nothing particularly new about the idea that presenting information in different ways changes people's behaviour. And there's certainly, the nudge is kind of agnostic in whether it's used for good or evil. And I mean, Facebook got into trouble, right, fairly recently for doing an experiment on their users without telling them what they were doing. I can't remember the details of it now, but I know that they eked out a statistically significant result from about 1 billion participants or something. It was something to do with the number of people who liked things on different sites. But yeah, there's certainly, there's the potential for it to be used in nefarious ways. Cigarette companies have been doing it for years.
If people are mindful of the way they're being nudged, do you think that would change their behaviour as opposed to if they weren't aware of how they were being sort of nudged towards a particular outcome?
Yeah, I mean, do you mean will it have a kind of backfiring effect if you're aware of what's going on?
Yeah, I imagine some people like it.
Wouldn't like it? No.
No, they feel like they were being manipulated.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that, often, as they're saying, the adoption of these things is very much in the spirit of the between subjects nature of experimental designs, right? So that unless Scott comes to me and says, hey, I got this fine letter with a big dirty red stamp on it, and I say, oh, that's weird because I got this one with a 8 out of 10, then you wouldn't know necessarily that you had been. I mean, you might, if you are a regular fine tractor, then you might think, oh, they've changed. And there is evidence that, certain types, certainly the social norming type ones, so, we all get these electricity bills now that say your electricity use is equivalent to a household of 2 people or 5 people or 3 people, and there's some evidence that you get a kind of boomerang effect on that. So if I get a bill in a household of 5 that says I'm using the same electricity as a household of 1, then I might say, result, let's crank the heaters up. Although, given current electricity prices, probably not. But yeah, so that it's not, it's not a one-to-one thing. Yeah.
Is there a difference from between countries in like how much you susceptible to be nudged?
Well, yeah, it's like the question we had earlier on about cross-cultural systems. I don't know the literature on that, but I'm sure that there probably is. The only kind of non-Western country that I know of that has a nudge unit at the moment is the Singaporean government. But I don't know too much about what they're doing. But I would imagine that there would be. I mean, there's cross-cultural differences in a lot of things. Once you get above a certain kind of low-level cognitive effects, once you get into anything higher level, cultural differences are probably going to play a role.
Would it be fair to conclude, and I hope this is relevant because it's coming from a bit more of an early childhood perspective, but when you were talking about, I guess, the relevance to intuition and that being of an early experience,
Yeah.
linked to a positive early experience, and also that of gearing a person's brain towards whether or not they can see that they're being nudged or taking on that information and having a broader perspective, the importance of that autonomy coming from an early age to sort of grow into a person who can have that broader perspective to make more informed decisions around information that's coming in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think the point about the intuition is nothing but experience or recognition is that I think the difficult thing with intuition. So people always say, "Oh, should I rely on my intuition? Should I go with my intuition?" And the point I think I'm trying to get across is that, and it's a hard question to answer, but it depends on whether that intuition is based on something that's likely to have been gained from a reliable set of experiences.
So I guess from an early childhood perspective, the importance of our relationships with children to be providing them opportunities to learn and grow on their own rather than making the decisions for them as often happens in early childhood.
Right.
Which is the feedback I would want to give to, say, my staff is these are some of the consequences of doing things for children and not giving them that autonomy to, later on in life make decisions like, is this information worth investigating further?
Yeah.
Or should I believe what's, plastered in front of me in a magazine or a newspaper?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, so the work on people sometimes contrast the idea of having kind environments for developing the right kind of experience or intuition and wicked ones. And the difference is often that in a kind one, you are able to sort of sample the world for yourself, and you're able to get direct feedback on those samples and the accuracy of the judgments that you subsequently make. Whereas in a wicked environment, you don't get the understanding of where that information's come from, or it's just given to you in some sort of descriptive form that you then can't unpack. So I think that probably resonates with the idea that, learning through discovery and then establishing what those rules are will help.
Perhaps we might. Sorry, go on. Can you-
I just wanted you mentioned there's like 100 different biases now. What are some of the ones that are most prominent, most curious, interesting?
Well, it's interesting because in the paper that I took that quote from by Pat Crosskerry, he has a table in the paper that literally lists like 50 of these things. But and then in a subsequent paper he says, "Oh, it's over 100 now." But if you dig into them, a lot of them are kind of the same thing. And this is what I'm trying to get at with this sort of narrow, broad thing. A lot of them are just saying you're not really, you're not thinking through the consequences of the rest of the information. And a lot of them, I think, are kind of variants on confirmation bias. So this notion that I kind of know what I think is the answer, and so I will seek further information to reinforce a hypothesis that I already have without considering reasons why that might be the wrong hypothesis at the start. That's not going to capture all of them, but if you think about the availability bias, which is all-encompassing, the idea that when you're asked to judge a probability of something, instead of judging the actual probability, you make a judgment based on how quickly you can generate an instance coming to mind, right? So if I say, how likely is it you're going to get attacked by a shark, then rather than thinking about the statistics, you might think about the last time someone got attacked by a shark out here, and you go, oh, yeah, it's pretty likely. But again, that's a kind of not considering the opposite or an alternative reason rather than anything else. So although you can probably, discreetly, and also there's a bias in the literature to identify another bias, right? Because then you can publish it. So look, I've identified the X bias, the bias, even though you maybe are just re-describing the same phenomenon.
I think Ami had something to say about that.
Yeah, I actually wanted to withdraw it, but now I was triggered. If I were a Martian...
If you were a what?
A
Martian, yes.
Only coming to this talk, and based on the number of biases and misperceptions and the really powerful demonstrations that you showed to us, I would think that I would go out and I see human beings dropping like flies because they have no way of coping with the environment. But, I mean, we can arguably say that people are doing reasonably well. How do you solve this discrepancy? How is it that we survive relatively well as individuals and as a species? We are quite prosperous with this inability, perhaps, to properly judge the environment and make rational decisions.
Well, I think that most of the time we can, and I think that although I've highlighted some examples of, there's a few examples of irrational things, but most of the examples are just framing things, right? It's not irrational to think that 36,500 is worse than 36. It's just that those different ways of presenting information elicit different reactions. But I agree entirely that in order to have got where we are, we can't be all that flawed. Although colleagues of mine, when I make this point, say, yeah, but what about obesity and smoking and climate change and all of the health problems? And how good are we really? So yeah, we might have made advances, but how rational are those advances? And on that negative note,
I think now would be a good time to thank Ben for coming along. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. That's very kind. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thanks.